The office was empty, the city asleep, and yet my boss kept me behind. Her voice was softer in the quiet, her eyes different in the glow of the desk lamp. And when she leaned close and whispered, "This stays between us," I knew this night would change everything. The office always felt different after dark. During the day, it was a constant rush, phones ringing, keyboards rattling, voices layered over one another like overlapping waves. But tonight, that noise had long faded. The rows of desks were empty, chairs tucked in neatly, and the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than ever. I sat at my desk, papers spread before me, trying to focus on the task she had asked me to finish. My boss, was still there, across the room, leaning over her own work. The glow of the desk lamp caught the edge of her profile, highlighting the curve of her cheek and the concentration in her eyes. She looked different without an audience, without the commanding presence she usually carried during the day. Alone in this quiet space, she seemed softer, though still no less striking. I told myself not to notice. She was my superior, someone with years of experience, confidence, and authority. But the silence pressed in on us, making every small detail feel amplified. The soft tap of her pen against paper, the quiet rustle of fabric when she shifted in her chair, even the faint fragrance of her perfume drifting across the space between us. At one point, she stood and walked toward my desk. The click of her heels echoed in the emptiness, sharp at first, and then fading as she slowed her pace. She stopped beside me, resting her hand lightly against the edge of the desk as she leaned in to glance at my work. "Not bad," she murmured, her voice lower, less formal than it ever was during the day. I nodded, suddenly aware of how close she was standing. The edge of her sleeve brushed against my arm as she pointed to a line on the page. It was the lightest touch, almost nothing at all, but it sent a ripple of warmth through me. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, reminding me of how late it had gotten. Most nights I would have been home by now, maybe scrolling through my phone or heating leftovers for dinner. But here I was, sitting in the dim light with her, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing just over my shoulder. It struck me that we weren't just colleagues at this moment. We were two people sharing a rare kind of stillness together. She wasn't giving instructions, and I wasn't following them. We were simply present, both of us suspended in the quiet, as though the rest of the world had forgotten about us. And in that quiet, something stirred that I didn't want to admit. It wasn't anything reckless, not even anything I could put into words. It was more like the awareness of standing at the edge of something unspoken, something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to name. Still, the thought lingered, why had she kept me here tonight, of all nights? She pulled a chair closer to my desk, the wheels rolling softly across the carpet until she was seated right beside me. The sound seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet office, almost like a signal that the distance between us was shrinking. We bent over the same stack of papers, her hand moving effortlessly across the page as she pointed out details I hadn't noticed before. I tried to follow her explanation, but my attention kept slipping, pulled not by the words, but by the way her sleeve brushed against my arm when she leaned closer. The fabric was cool at first, then warm as the touch lingered. I told myself to focus, to keep my eyes on the ink and the lines of text. But it was impossible not to notice how the soft light of the desk lamp made her hair catch a faint sheen, or how the perfume she wore, a subtle, elegant scent, seemed stronger now that we were only inches apart. Every so often, she would pause, her pen hovering over the page. And in those silences, I felt her attention shift toward me. Not overtly, not in a way that could be called obvious, but enough. I could sense it, the way you can sense the heat from a candle even before you see the flame. I dared to glance sideways, just once. Her eyes were fixed on the paper, but her lips curved ever so slightly, as though she'd caught me looking. I forced a small cough, pretending to adjust the papers. She didn't comment, but her pen tapped lightly against the margin, then stilled. "You catch on quickly," she said after a moment. Her tone was even, professional, but there was something beneath it. Something quieter, more personal. "Thanks," I managed, my voice lower than usual. For a moment, the silence stretched again. She leaned forward, her shoulder brushing mine as she slid the paper closer. I could feel the warmth of her body just beside me, close enough that the air between us seemed charged. I tried to remind myself that this was work. That she was my boss, guiding me through something I needed to learn. But the way her voice softened each time she spoke, the way her movements slowed instead of rushing, told me there was more happening here than simple instruction. I could feel my heartbeat, steady but noticeable, as though my chest had suddenly become too small to contain it. Her hand rested briefly on the desk, fingers close enough to mine that I wondered, just for a second, if she meant to close the gap. She didn't. But neither of us moved away. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the lights above, and in that stillness, something unspoken passed between us. A shared awareness, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't obvious. But it was there, growing quietly, like the warmth of a fire you don't realize has caught until you feel it spreading through the room. She pulled a chair closer to my desk, the wheels rolling softly across the carpet until she was seated right beside me. The sound seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet office, almost like a signal that the distance between us was shrinking. We bent over the same stack of papers, her hand moving effortlessly across the page as she pointed out details I hadn't noticed before. I tried to follow her explanation, but my attention kept slipping, pulled not by the words, but by the way her sleeve brushed against my arm when she leaned closer. The fabric was cool at first, then warm as the touch lingered. I told myself to focus, to keep my eyes on the ink and the lines of text. But it was impossible not to notice how the soft light of the desk lamp made her hair catch a faint sheen, or how the perfume she wore, a subtle, elegant scent, seemed stronger now that we were only inches apart. Every so often, she would pause, her pen hovering over the page. And in those silences, I felt her attention shift toward me. Not overly, not in a way that could be called obvious, but enough. I could sense it, the way you can sense the heat from a candle even before you see the flame. I dared to glance sideways just once. Her eyes were fixed on the paper, but her lips curved ever so slightly, as though she'd caught me looking. I forced a small cough, pretending to adjust the papers. She didn't comment, but her pen tapped lightly against the margin, then stilled. "You catch on quickly," she said after a moment. Her tone was even, professional, but there was something beneath it, something quieter, more personal. "Thanks," I managed, my voice lower than usual. For a moment, the silence stretched again. She leaned forward, her shoulder brushing mine as she slid the paper closer. I could feel the warmth of her body just beside me, close enough that the air between us seemed charged. I tried to remind myself that this was work. That she was my boss, guiding me through something I needed to learn. But the way her voice softened each time she spoke, the way her movements slowed instead of rushing, told me there was more happening here than simple instruction. I could feel my heartbeat, steady but noticeable, as though my chest had suddenly become too small to contain it. Her hand rested briefly on the desk, fingers close enough to mine that I wondered, just for a second, if she meant to close the gap. She didn't. But neither of us moved away. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the lights above, and in that stillness, something unspoken passed between us. A shared awareness, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't obvious. But it was there, growing quietly, like the warmth of a fire you don't realize has caught until you feel it spreading through the room. The hours slipped by unnoticed. What began as a stack of paperwork had turned into a kind of quiet rhythm between us, passing documents back and forth, trading brief comments, the occasional shared smile when one of us caught a mistake. At some point, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a long, tired breath. It wasn't the kind of sigh I usually heard from her during the day, the one laced with authority or impatience. This was different. It was softer, almost fragile, like air escaping after being held in for too long. I glanced at her. She pressed her fingertips against her temple, eyes closing briefly before brushing a strand of hair away from her face. The movement was small, almost ordinary, but in that moment it revealed something I'd never noticed before. Beneath all her composure, Beneath the polished confidence she carried so easily, there was a quiet exhaustion. "It gets lonely sometimes," she said suddenly, her voice low, as if speaking more to the room than to me. I wasn't sure if she meant for me to respond, so I waited, letting her continue at her own pace. "People assume success is glamorous," she added after a pause, her eyes fixed on the papers scattered across the desk. "But it comes with trade-offs. Long hours. Empty apartments. Missed dinners." She gave a short, almost self-deprecating laugh. "The kind of silence no one really tells you about." Her words hung in the air, fragile, honest. I had never seen this side of her before. The woman I knew during the day was decisive, confident, commanding, someone who could silence a room with one look. But here, in the quiet, with the city lights glowing faintly through the windows, she was different. I swallowed, unsure what to say but feeling a weight press in my chest. "That sounds hard," I finally murmured. It felt inadequate, but it was all I had. Her gaze shifted toward me, steady yet searching. For a moment, it seemed like she was testing whether I really meant it. Then, slowly, her expression softened. "It is," she admitted. Her hand dropped from her temple to the desk, fingers brushing the edge of a folder. "But you don't say that out loud. Not if you want people to take you seriously." I watched the way she tucked her hair back behind her ear, the faint tremor in her hand as she did it. It wasn't weakness, it was humanity. And something about seeing her like this, stripped of the armor she wore so naturally, made me feel protective in a way I hadn't expected. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, yes, but in the kind of way that makes you aware of how close you're sitting to someone. Of how rare it is to share a moment that feels unguarded, unscripted. For the first time, I wasn't just seeing my boss. I was seeing the woman behind the title, the one who carried more than anyone realized, who wanted someone, even if just for a moment, to notice. And I couldn't stop myself from noticing. Her confession lingered in the air long after she fell silent. I didn't push her to say more, and she didn't seem to expect me to. Instead, we returned to the papers between us, but the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just about work anymore. There was something heavier, unspoken, resting between us like the weight of an unopened letter. She leaned forward to point out a note I had scribbled, her hand guiding mine across the page. For a second, I thought she might withdraw quickly, but she didn't. Our fingers brushed, light, accidental perhaps, but neither of us moved away. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a ripple of warmth through me that spread all the way to my chest. I looked up, almost without meaning to. Her eyes were already on me. It wasn't the sharp, assessing look she gave in meetings. This was softer, uncertain even, like she was caught off guard by her own hesitation. And in that moment, her gaze flicked, just briefly, toward my mouth before she pulled it back to the paper. My heart picked up, steady but strong, the kind of beat you notice in your ears. The silence of the office made it louder, as though the space itself had sharpened every detail, the faint hum of the lights, the muted ticking of the clock, the warmth radiating from where her arm pressed close to mine. She cleared her throat softly, straightening a sheet of paper that didn't really need straightening. But even in that small motion, I could see her composure slip. Her breath was just a touch uneven, and for the first time since I had known her, I realized she might be just as unsettled as I was. "Here," she said quietly, sliding the folder closer to me. Her voice wasn't its usual steady register, it carried a gentleness that pulled me in more than the words themselves. I took the folder, careful, deliberate. My hand brushed against hers again. This time she didn't move it away immediately. Her fingertips rested lightly against mine, cool at first, but then warming as if she had decided, in that small second, not to retreat. I didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence was full, stretching taut, not with discomfort but with something else, something that pressed in close and made every inch between us feel charged. When she finally drew her hand back, it was slow, deliberate, almost reluctant. She kept her eyes on the papers, but I noticed the way she pressed her lips together, as if holding back words she wasn't ready to say. For a long moment, All I could do was sit there, caught between respect and desire, between knowing where the line was and feeling how close we were to crossing it. The shift was subtle. Barely anything had happened at all. And yet I knew that when I looked at her now, I would never see her the same way again. By the time the stack of papers had finally thinned, the clock on the wall was edging toward midnight. The office had become a different world, no longer the bustling, fluorescent-lit space I knew, but something quieter, more intimate. The city lights spilled faint reflections across the windows, flickering faintly against the polished desks. She closed the final folder with a quiet thud, exhaling in relief. "That's it," she murmured, her voice carrying a softness that made the words feel more personal than professional. I nodded, leaning back in my chair, suddenly aware of how heavy my eyelids felt and how long we'd been sitting shoulder to shoulder. Yet, instead of exhaustion, what I felt most was a strange kind of electricity, like I was waiting for something I couldn't quite name. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her blouse with one hand, the other brushing her hair back from her face. For a moment, I thought she was about to gather her things and leave. But instead, she stepped closer, slowly, as though testing the ground beneath her feet with each movement. I rose instinctively, unsure whether to speak or simply follow her lead. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but the way she said them made my chest tighten. They weren't the clipped, professional thanks I had heard from her countless times before. This was different. There was a warmth, almost an intimacy, in the way her voice wrapped around them. I tried to respond, but my throat caught. All I managed was a nod, though my eyes never left hers. She took one more step closer. The space between us narrowed until I could see the faint shimmer of exhaustion around her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips as she searched for the right words. Then she leaned in, not dramatically, not hurriedly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided, just for a moment, to let the walls come down. Her breath brushed against my cheek, warm and delicate, carrying the faintest trace of her perfume. Her lips came near my ear, and in the softest whisper she said, "This stays between us." The words landed like a spark in the silence, igniting something inside me I didn't have a name for. They weren't just instructions. They were a secret, a confession, a thread tying me to her in a way that no one else could see. I froze, not out of fear, but because of the sheer weight of the moment. Her voice lingered in me like a melody I wanted to replay over and over. When she pulled back, her eyes caught mine again. For a heartbeat, we didn't move, suspended in the fragile space where anything could happen. And then, as though nothing had passed between us, she gave a small, almost unreadable smile. But I could still feel her words, still feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. It was the kind of moment you couldn't mistake. The kind why her whisper still echoed inside me, even as silence settled back over the room. "This stays between us." The words replayed with every beat of my heart, each repetition sharpening the sense that something fragile had just been shared, a secret not of paper or work, but of longing neither of us dared to name outright. She gathered the last of the folders, stacking them neatly, almost too carefully. I could tell her mind wasn't fully on the papers. Her movements were measured, deliberate, like someone buying herself time. I stayed still, unsure if speaking would break the fragile thread holding us in this moment together. When she finally lifted her bag from the back of her chair, she hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the strap, knuckles paling for a second before she loosened her grip again. That tiny flicker of indecision felt louder than words. I rose, my chair scraping softly against the carpet, and the sound made her glance back at me. Our eyes locked. The distance between us wasn't much, just a handful of steps, but it felt like a line neither of us was certain we should cross. Her gaze lingered, steady yet questioning. For the first time, I thought I saw fear there, not fear of me, but fear of what it would mean if either of us acknowledged what was happening. I took a slow breath, trying to quiet the storm inside me. Part of me wanted to close that distance, to take her hand, to show her that she didn't have to carry her solitude alone. But another part of me knew the risk, the weight of what such a step would mean. The silence pressed in, thick and charged. I could hear the faint hum of the air vent above us, the soft tick of the clock, even the sound of her breathing, slower than usual, as though she was steadying herself. She adjusted the strap of her bag again, her hand trembling just slightly before she steadied it. It was such a small detail, but it revealed everything she didn't say. She was holding herself back, restraining the impulse I could almost feel mirrored in my own chest. For a moment, I thought she would speak. Her lips parted, but then she closed them, choosing silence instead. It was me who broke it, though not in the way I imagined. "Let me walk you out," I said softly, my voice barely above the hush of the room. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite name, relief, maybe, or gratitude that I hadn't forced the unspoken into words. She gave a small nod. As we moved toward the elevator, the distance between us remained, yet every step felt like walking a tightrope. My hands stayed at my sides, though they itched with the urge to reach for hers. She walked just close enough that her sleeve brushed mine once or twice, each contact leaving a trace of warmth long after it passed. At the doors, she paused, turning slightly toward me. For the briefest moment, her eyes softened, almost as if she wanted to lean into me, to close that aching gap. But instead, she offered a quiet smile, the kind that carried both promise and restraint. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside. I stayed where I was, watching, caught in the heavy silence of everything we didn't say. And yet I knew, so did she, that the moment had already changed us. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft sigh, carrying her down through the quiet building. I stood there for a few seconds longer, staring at the empty space where she had just been, my chest still caught in the rhythm of everything we hadn't said. The office felt strangely hollow without her presence. The lamp still glowed on my desk, casting long shadows across the floor, but the air seemed heavier now, as if it knew something rare had passed between us. I gathered my things slowly, not wanting to break the moment too quickly, not wanting to accept that it was really over. By the time I reached the lobby, she was waiting. She stood near the glass doors, her figure outlined by the faint shimmer of city lights beyond. For a moment, I wondered if she had paused intentionally, or if it was only coincidence. But when she turned, her eyes finding mine, I realized she had been waiting. Either of us spoke as I joined her. The city outside was hushed, its late-night rhythm softened into distant traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps. I pushed the door open for her, and the night air swept in, cool, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. She stepped through, her hand brushing lightly against my forearm as she passed. It wasn't accidental. The touch was too deliberate, too gentle, lingering just long enough for me to feel the warmth of her skin seep through the sleeve of my shirt. "Thank you for staying late," she said at last, her voice quiet, almost fragile in the night. I shook my head. "I didn't mind." The words came out softer than I intended, as though admitting that the hours together had been something I wouldn't trade for anything. She smiled faintly, and for the first time, it wasn't the composed, professional smile she wore during the day. It was warmer, smaller, touched with something unspoken. We walked toward the curb, side by side, not rushing. Our steps fell into an easy rhythm, and though we didn't speak, the silence between us felt different now, less guarded, more comfortable, like a language only we could understand. When we reached her car, she turned to me. For a heartbeat, her hand hovered in the air, as if unsure what gesture to make. Then she rested it gently on my arm, her fingers pressing lightly into the fabric. The touch was steady, lingering, as though she was memorizing the moment just as much as I was. "Good night," she said softly. I nodded, holding her gaze. "Good night." Her hand slipped away slowly, almost reluctantly, before she stepped into the car. I stood there as she drove off, the red glow of her taillights fading into the distance. The night air felt cool against my skin, but the warmth of her touch remained, pulsing faintly like an ember I carried with me. As I walked home beneath the quiet city lights, I knew the story between us hadn't ended, it had only begun. Whatever boundaries or secrets lay ahead, tonight had carved out a space we both understood, something tender, something fragile, something that, at least for now, belonged only to us.